Okay, people, today we are going to be outlining chapter 19, which is progressivism, or commonly known as the Progressive Reform Era. This is chapter 18. Reading focus questions. Okay, so what were the key goals of the progressives? How did the ideas of progressive writers help to inspire new reform movements? What reform organizations and what women reformers took up progressive causes? Why did progressive reforms meet with resistance? Main idea. At the end of the 1800s, problems resulting from rapid industrialization, immigration, and urban growth spurred the creation of many reform movements during what is known as the Progressive Era. The time period was 1890 to 1920. So one of the first terms that we are going to define is muckraker. A muckrake is actually somewhat of a pitchfork, and it's used to clean like manure and hay out of stables. Roosevelt, however, took the term muckraker from a book, Pilgrim's Progress, which was published in 1678, in which one of the characters was too busy raking filth on earth to lift his eyes to heaven. Journalists like Upton Sinclair, played a key role in alerting the public to wrongdoing in politics and business during this time of need of reform, resolve, and change. Another key term is injunction. An injunction is a court order that prohibits a certain activity, like picketing or stalking. How about that? Courts often issued injunctions preventing workers from going on strike. There were several routes of reform, so I'm just going to list them. One was nativism, prohibition, populism, purity crusades, electoral reform, charity reform, social gospel philosophy, and settlement house movements. These are also terms that you should be very familiar with. Okay, let's talk about the goals and beliefs of the progressives. The government felt that, or the progressives felt that, the government should be more accountable to its citizens. They also felt that the government should curb the power and influence of wealthy interests, that the government should be given expanded powers so that it could become more active in improving the lives of other citizens. Governments should become more efficient and less corrupt so that they could competently handle an expanded role. There were key writers during this period of time, and they ignited reform. They sparked debates about how to reform society. They influenced public opinion, so the public would pressure legislators to pass and enforce new laws. Women's clubs and charity groups provided leadership to implement reforms. And they worked hard to bring about change in a systematic manner. They also investigated issues like slum conditions and therefore. One of the key writers, his name was Henry George. He wrote a book called Progress and Poverty, and it was an effort to explain why poverty continued to plague such an advanced civilization. A journalist, self-taught economist, he concluded that poverty arose because some people bought and held onto land until its price went up, which was called speculation. and this prevented others from using the land productively. He was an advocate of single tax on value of the land itself, and he made speculation less attractive, or his views made speculation less attractive. George's ideas had a powerful effect. Let's go through a few key leaders and groups. Unions were big. Socialists, women's groups, obviously, journalists like George Bellamy Sinclair. In 1901, there was a group called the Socialist Party of America. In 1899, the National Consumers League, the NCL, was developed. And International Workers of the World, IWW, was also a very key group. Make sure that you know these. So let me tell you a little bit about Edward Bellamy now. He was a newspaper editor. He published a novel called Looking Backward, and it was a phenomenal bestseller. It was a story about a man undergoing hypnosis and walking in the year 2000, waking up in the year 2000, to a completely transitioned society in the United States. Imagine that. He woke up in the year 2000. He woke up to no poverty, no harsh working conditions, no political corruption, just a utopian country like we all want to wake up to. The government was in control of large companies. Companies were reorganized with the goal of meeting human needs over personal profit. Go figure. This book and Bellamy's ideas influenced the promotion of over 100 nationalist clubs and ultimately the Populist Party platform in 1892. This is all section 1 of chapter 18. We're going to move on to section 2. I'm going to give you the reading focus questions. How did the progressives wish to expand the role of government? What municipal and state reforms did progressives achieve? What federal reforms did Theodore Roosevelt champion as president? Main idea in this section would be, because of public demand, local, state, and federal officials enacted major progressive reforms in the early 1900s. And your key terms here, make sure that you know them, are social welfare program, municipal home rule, direct primary, initiative, referendum, and recall. One of the key events that became a push in the progressives' goal base was something that happened in New York City in a factory called the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. You may have heard of this story. It was a factory up on the 11th floor in, one of the high rises in New York City, and someone threw a cigarette butt or a match into a waste paper basket. The waste paper basket was filled with clippings, like shirt clippings, material, and obviously it caught on fire. Okay, what happened was the women were alerted, not in much of a rapid pace, because communication back then was a little slow. Someone called down to the switchboard took its time going back up, and so forth. Bottom line is 146 of those women died. A woman named Rose Snyderman. She was a 29-year-old labor leader, a Jewish immigrant from Poland. She became one of the nation's best-known women labor leaders, and she stirred powerful public support for new reforms. Some of these reforms, sorry about that, called on the city to appoint fire inspectors, compulsory fire drills, unlocked and fireproof exits. It required automatic sprinklers in buildings more than 7 stories. That was mainly because the ladders on the fire trucks don't reach higher than 7, maybe 9 stories based on the height of the floors. And it resulted in New York's Tammany government bowing to the pressure and adopting new workplace protections. So we can thank those 146 women who gave their lives for things like our current day fire extinguishers, old-fashioned fire escapes, and all of the safety measures that are put in place, like, for instance, sprinklers in these high-rise buildings. An expanded role for government. Progressives wanted more government regulation to protect workers' rights and business competition. Government should increase its responsibility for the welfare or well-being of people. Social welfare programs to ensure a minimum standard of living. Things like unemployment benefits were on the table, accident and health insurance, the Social Security system for the elderly or disabled, all of the things that we rely on as a society now were put in place because of those progressive movements. Progressives, they envisioned a government that relied on experts and scientists to plan efficient programs managed by professionals, not politicians. Some of the municipal reforms were things like cities were now home to, or at the time were home to, most settlement workers. These workers were moving from the south, coming east, coming north, and they lived in these horrible conditions in order to get these jobs. They were also home to club members and professionals who wanted change made at the local level. Most municipal reformers worked for home rule. Home rule is a system that gave cities a limited degree of self-rule. So these cities should be able to make specific legislation for their own cities. Free control from or by state government, big business, or rural interests, and free from control by political machines like Tammany. Although sometimes naive, municipal activists formed an important part of this era's spirit of reform because they were attacking the bosses by running city campaigns against them, like Seth Low. Now, Seth Low was a professor and the president of Columbia University, same Columbia University in New York that we know and love. And he ran for mayor. He didn't win, but he did sort of push the envelope. New forms of municipal government were things like in 1900, during the hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, the people of Galveston, Texas created an effective emergency commission to replace the mayor and the alderman. So when the mayor and the alderman didn't act quickly enough, they came together and created their own committees and commissions in order to take care of the people of that city. In 1913, Ohio had Ohio's Great Miami River Basin had this huge flood, and Dayton became the first large city to adopt a council manager for the government. So these things were unheard of at the time and set precedents. Cities were also taking over utilities. This is this home rule. Reformers attempting to take over regulation of city utilities like water, gas, and electricity provided by the big monopolies resulted in some city-owned utilities by 1915. Some city mayors that enacted these attempted takeovers or regulation were mayors of, like the mayor of Detroit in 1889. His name was Pingree. Mayor of Toledo, Sam Jones, in 1897. And also Mayor Tom Johnson of Cleveland, Ohio, in 1901. So that's a good thing. Providing welfare services. Those same mayors provided public baths, parks, and a work relief program for Detroit. That was our Mayor Pingree. Mayor Jones opened up playgrounds, free kindergartens, and lodging houses for the homeless in Toledo, believing that all people would become good citizens if social conditions were also good. So you should be able to recreate when you work hard. We believe that. State reforms. So on the state level, governors and state legislators also promoted progressive reforms, more power to voters through things like direct primaries, an election which citizens vote to select nominees for upcoming elections. Also, initiatives where citizens can put a proposed law directly on the ballot in the next election by collecting voters' signatures on a petition. And of course, referendum, which allows citizens to approve or reject a law passed by the legislature. Those are good things. There were also reforms in the workplace. States established labor departments to provide information and dispute resolution services to employers. That's like our HR departments now. Workers' accident insurance and compensation systems, another huge reform that we see in our today's society. In response to pushback by the business owners, reformers argued that the Constitution reserves police powers to the states, and the states could use these powers to intervene in the workplace to protect workers. Let's see, in 1908, so there was a Supreme Court case, Muller versus Oregon, where the court upheld an Oregon law that limited hours for female laundry workers to 10 hours a day. Imagine that, 10 hours a day, because it would harm them, their legs and pelvic area. Okay. Others would be, let's see, 1907. Nearly 2/3 of states had abolished child labor, which is defined as of children under 14, because these children were now supposed to be in school, you know? Minimum wage laws for women and children also made headway, with Florence Kelley leading a national campaign. 1912, Massachusetts adopted a minimum wage, and 8 other states followed. Massachusetts was one of the first, obviously. One of the most determined progressives in U.S. politics was Robert La Follette, and he was Wisconsin's reform governor. And he got the nickname Fighting Bob because of his efforts to clean up government and produce social welfare reforms. He served 3 terms as governor. He ousted party bosses and brought structural changes, direct primary, and civil service reform. He called upon academic experts to help draft reform legislation, academic and citizen committees to run regulatory agencies, and the Wisconsin idea of a public academic alliance to improve government became known worldwide. That would be nationwide. So worldwide doesn't make sense. He also served on the Senate from 1906 to his death, which would have occurred in 1925. He promoted progressive legislation on the federal level. He was famous for his independence from business interests and progressive parties. He was the Progressive Party's candidate for president in 1924. He didn't win either, but he did earn 1/6 of the vote, which is a pretty good number. Federal reforms. We've done municipal, we've done state, let's do federal. Now we're up to President Theodore Roosevelt. He created the modern presidency, in which the chief executive became a strong political force. He was he was the first president who believed that the White House should have political force, political prowess, so he got involved. But one of the major deals that he made, called the TR Square deal, in May of 1902, united mine workers who were striking to protest low wages. But there was a problem because it was the winter and there was no heat for the citizens. So he brought them to the table, both sides, and made them submit to arbitration, and he threatened to use the army to seize and work the mines. So obviously the mine workers went back to work, and they got a 10% raise. Their work hours were reduced to 10 hours, from 10 to 9 hours. I mean, it's an hour, but it's better than nothing, right? But the point was, there was a third-party arbitrator enforced by the president, the White House. This was a big deal. There was also antitrust activism, where things like a holding company, which would be someone or a firm, a company that buys up stocks and bonds of smaller companies, could create a monopoly. Like that wasn't very helpful to our economy. So he didn't want that either. And that's good. Railroad regulation, 1906, was the Hepburn Act. This act moved the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, out of its largely weak advisory role and gave it strong enforcement powers that were essentially both legislative and judicial. ICC was to set and regulate railroad rates. So we have the ICC of 1906 the Hepburn Act to thank for regulating railroad rates. Let's see what else we have. Protecting public health. 1906, laws required accurate labeling of ingredients, strict sanitary conditions, and a rating system for meats. These conditions were brought out by our muckrakers, specifically up in Sinclair. So the Pure Food and Drug Act was created. The Meat Inspection Act was created. And also in the labor area, a new labor department was created. In 1912, the Children's Bureau was created, and in 1913, a cabinet-level Department of Labor was created. Then we get to the environment. We had to also protect the environment as far as Mr. Roosevelt was concerned. So he urged Congress to protect the nation's natural resources. And he did that by reserving 35 million acres of forest land. He started in Yellowstone Park in Wyoming. That was the nation's first park. Yosemite in California, and the Presidents Harrison and Cleveland were involved in that 35 million acre forest land reservation. 1902, the National Reclamation Act was passed, and in 1905, Teddy Roosevelt set aside 200 million acres for national forests, mineral reserves, and water projects. New constitutional amendments, like the 16th Amendment, which authorized Congress to collect federal income taxes. The 16th Amendment allowed people to be taxed that were making higher incomes or had higher incomes. This was 1913. 1913 also was the 17th Amendment, which required direct election of senators. 1919 came the 18th Amendment, which banned the production, sale, or import of alcoholic beverages. Yay. They could no longer get drunk at work and go home and beat their wives. Although there was not a complete agreement on this, the progressives thought this would lessen the negative effects. So we know that was overturned, but whatever. We'll get to that. Okay, so we are up to section 4. Reading focus questions. In what ways were Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton a bridge to the 20th century suffrage effort? Okay, I'm going to do this again, excuse me. What two main strategies did suffrage leaders pursue? What was the status of the suffrage movement by the turn of the century? What was a new generation of national leaders, or why, sorry, I said what, right, needed in the suffrage effort, and what factors led to a final victory for suffrage, which would be the 19th Amendment. The main idea of this section is we are demonstrating their skills as organizers and activists. These women won the right to vote with the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Your key terms in this section would be Civil Disobedience, National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NASA, and the Congressional Union. Women's suffrage went on for over 70 years, and organizations actively campaigned for the right to vote. And specific campaign protagonists would be Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony, just to name a few. Alice Paul was also very big, and we'll talk about her later. Okay, Anthony and Stanton. Stanton and Anthony became the nation's most celebrated champions of women's suffrage. In 1866, Stanton and Anthony founded the American Equal Rights Association. 1866 was also the American Equal Rights Association publication of a newspaper called the Revolution. And Susan B. Anthony petitioned for the vote in 1868. They split off into two groups. Stanton and Anthony continued as the National Women's Suffrage Association to fight for a constitutional amendment